Now I'm going to assume you have been able to insert your memory card into your computer or connected your camera. Make note that a lot of cameras, when you connect them via USB, you might need to turn your camera on in order for it to show up on your computer. And we're going to use Adobe Bridge. I'm going to open Adobe Bridge in my computer and talk about its interface briefly. I have given you some supplemental videos that'll go a little bit more in depth into this. In general, when you have something plugged in, it's going to automatically open what's called the photo downloader. I'm going to cancel this so you can see another way to open this as well. Up here is a little icon that looks like a little camera. It says get photos from camera. It's got a little camera with a downward button. If you select that, it's going to open up Photo Downloader again. Now I'm going to select the device that I believe has my image on it. Then I'm going to enter what's called the Advanced Dialog. When we enter the Advanced Dialog, I'm going to open this up a little so you can see better. You can do this as well. And you can see that you have a selection of images on this memory card. They're all checked here, and I can uncheck all of them or check all of them. If I uncheck all of them, I can select images by checking them. I can also select between a selection, so if I hold down the Shift key and I select that checkbox, it'll select everything between those two. If I hold down Command, it will deselect these images, but it doesn't do what it normally does on most applications. You have to actually deselect certain, you have to deselect the check box to do that. So keep in mind, when you select these and it's highlighted, that doesn't mean it's actually selected. You have to select those checkboxes. So I'm going to select a few of these here. I'm going to show you the first thing you need to look at here is your save options. We're going to choose where to save these images, and that brings us back to our workflow and organizing and archiving demo. I'm going to go to my folder for long 1. This is part 2, and I'm going to use these for part 2. If you want to store these as your raw folder, raw images for part 1, since you shot 300 of them, that would be the place to do it. So we'll start there. We'll assume that we're going to that raw folder under part 1. We're going to use some of these images for part 2, 10 of them in fact, and we can download those individually if we like, or we can pull them from this raw folder. So here I'm under part 1, my raw folder. I'm going to select open, and that's going to tell this photo downloader within Adobe Bridge that I want the images that I've selected here to download to that location. Now it's going to create subfolders within Adobe Bridge by default. I like to keep the default settings here because I think they make the most sense. In a way of organizing our files, it helps to think in terms of years, months, and days in that order. That makes most sense when trying to organize your images as well, because if you had, say for instance, month first, you could really easily muddle up June photographs that you took and you remember taking in June last year with June this year, because the way that it's going to organize things is by that month of 06, and it'll clump those together instead of everything in a set year. So I highly recommend keeping that as is. Don't worry about anything else here. Keep Adobe Bridge as where you're going to open these, and then we can talk more about these settings later if necessary. You can also, a very powerful tool here is to copy these to 2 locations. So you could be saving to your computer, but also to your external drive at the same time. And you would again choose in a similar way a path for where you wanted those images or those copies to go. So I'm going to say get media here at the very bottom right hand corner. It's going to download. I selected 12 images here. We're going to wait for that to download. Hopefully that'll take nothing more than a second. And then it's going to pop open in Bridge as a series of subfolders. So you can see here 2008. This was taken on the 29th. This one was taken today. So I'll go ahead and open up the one today. This is shot in what is Sony's version of a RAW format, which is called a .arw. I can select this image. I can enlarge it down in the bottom right here. I can look at it in different forms, in a thumbnail, as a list form, and you can see these different options maybe a little better with a selection of images. So here I can zoom these in or out. I can see these as a list, and so on and so forth. So when you do select one of these images, I want you to notice that there's something that pops up for us called metadata. Metadata is the data that's encoded into that file that is recorded to the memory card. And that's going to give you all the information like the settings on your camera that this image was shot, the date, time, what kind of format it's in, the type of camera you use, the resolution, the file size, etc. You can add metadata to this as well if you wanted through things like keywords and stuff like that, but we'll hold off on doing any of that more complicated stuff later. Again, I've given you some supplementary videos on Adobe Bridge, so if you want to go more in depth in using this, you're fine to do that, but I'm going to work us through basic workflow for this assignment. So I have right now what's called a raw image. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to, by default, this image is going to open up into what's called Camera Raw. So what I did is I double-clicked that image. You can also select this icon up here that'll open it up into Camera Raw, but it's going to open up what's called Camera Raw, which is a gateway application for raw images to be processed into Photoshop. We're going to get in more in depth into this process later, but for right now I'm going to skip this stage, and we're going to go over editing in Camera Raw prior to bringing in our images into Photoshop. So I'm going to open this image, and it's going to open into Adobe Photoshop for me. I'm going to make this image or this screen a little larger for us. Now, I like to have my Photoshop template, the kind of screen that it opens up to, into a preset mode of what's called photography. Most of yours might default to being an essentials folder or a template for organizing your images. I like to keep mine in what's called photography, and I do that for the obvious reasons, because we're editing photographs and it's going to give me the options most likely I'll be using and windows that I'd most likely be using in Adobe Photoshop. So right over here in the bottom right hand corner we have what's called our layers window. This is showing a background layer. It's locked, it's viewable. Right now there's an eye here, and it's showing this image that I've brought into Photoshop. I want you to also notice that up here, just like in a web browser, it creates what's called a tab for your image. This tab is movable. You can move it out and make it a separate window. You can exchange them with other images and tabs you have available. Just trying to mimic what you see online. Now, the first thing I like to do when I bring this image into Photoshop is I like to immediately duplicate my background layer. So I've right-clicked on the background layer here and selected duplicate. You can also select this series of lines up in the far right-hand corner of the layers window, and that will give you a duplicate layer option. And I'm going to go ahead and select that, and you'll see it'll give me an option of titling that. I'm just going to leave it as a background copy. Now the reason why I like to do this is because you have the ability to kind of easily overwrite the original file that you have here, and I want to be cautious and give myself a way of backing out of any of my edits, so I can always come back to that original if I need to or want to. Now from here we're going to work on what are called adjustment layers, and so these adjustment layers in your basic information, or the basic knowledge of adjustment layers for us right now in Photoshop, is to work in what's called non-destructive editing. Now I gave a link to a non-destructive editing file in one of our documents on this assignment, but essentially we're going to be creating what are called layers that act as code. This is code that will save to this file, and this file will be able to tell Photoshop what to do this image, but it won't actually do it onto the image itself. So it'll be linked in essence to that file, but it's not actually permanently doing any of those edits to the image. That'll make some more sense as we work along through this process, but first I want to just acknowledge that we're going to be working in adjustment layers. Now if you don't see this adjustment layers here, you're going to want to open up what is called the adjustment layers window. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate. If I toggle that off, it disappears. If I toggle it on, it reappears. Now these are a series of preset adjustment layers that you can use in Photoshop. And I'm going to go over turning our images to black and white. So I'm going to convert. This is the adjustment layer that's called Create a New Black and White Adjustment Layer. If I select that, my image now turns black and white. It opens up what's called a Properties pane, and I'm going to play around with some of these defaults. I recommend you do this as well. And I'm just interested in you play around with those, see what you like, see what you don't. Now I close that pane to show you where that properties window is available to you. But if I leave that property right there and I select my background copy, what you notice, this created what's called an adjustment layer. That's called black and white. If I want to come back to that property settings, I can double click or click on this little icon here that looks like a circle. That'll bring me back to adjusting some of these. Now at this stage we have gotten to converting our images to black and white. Now I want you to make two more adjustment layers to this image. Now these are adjustment layers. One I'd like you to make that would be kind of more objective or more of a normal edit that we could all maybe agree. Something like maybe your image is too dark, you just make it a little bit brighter, and that would be something we could all say, yeah, that's a good idea. Then I also want you to make a subjective edit to this by doing something to this image that you would like to see but isn't necessarily right or wrong. I want you to note that you can bring color back into this if you'd like. So let me show you, for example, if I come back to Photoshop here, maybe I want to give the adjustment layer of brightness and contrast. I'm going to darken this image a little but give it some more contrast. Now maybe in terms of that would be an objective one, maybe we could all agree that adds some drama to this image, but maybe the subjective edit here would be adding some color. So maybe I want to add a color filter or photo filter to this, and I'm going to maybe cool this filter, and I'm going to increase the density of it. So now I've created a blue hue over this image. Now at this stage, I want you to make sure that you're thinking about saving your image. So I'm going to go to File, I'm going to go to Save As. I'm going to locate the folder structure under Data, long one. We're in part 2 of this assignment, and I'm going to save this as a PSD. I'm going to save that as a Photoshop document. I'm going to say OK.